This is Shingi with the Soba DeFi. And today I want to talk about the interplay between Western climate activism, degrowth, anti-capitalism, and the global south. And first I'll start with just sort of my take on Western climate activism as it stands today, which is largely driven by people who are not subject matter expertise or not subject matter experts, who don't have a deep understanding of a lot of the social, the financial, or political mechanisms that are required to drive the general level of change that they're demanding. But more importantly, these are people that don't actually have a tangible, specific vision of what the world needs to look like. They substitute knowledge in these particular areas with passion and with performative drama and with God complex. And what I mean by that is this, that the vast majority of movements, or the vast majority of high-profile climate activists, whether it's in Europe or the United States, they're primarily people that are in their teens or their early 20s. These are very young people. I'm not going to name specific names. This is not specific to one group or one set of people, but these are behaviors that I'm noticing across the board within the entire space. Right? These are people that think that passion, that think that vitriol, that think that a sense of self-righteousness is adequate substitute for an actual understanding of the systems in which they are moving within and that they seek to change. That obviously is very problematic, particularly when you start to apply some of that same kind of thinking to proselytizing people in the global south about lifestyles and about consumption and about things like degrowth. Because what happens is you're taking somebody who has very little life experience and even less subject matter authority or expertise in any of the aspects related to climate change, a very sort of specific lane that climate activists are going to walk. Like, these are not people that are actually from developing world countries. These are not people that do business in developing world countries or spend extensive amount of time in the social milieu of the global south. And yet they will still, with the same sense of self-righteousness, speak to and lecture people in the global south about topics related to consumption, about degrowth, about what types of energy should be used by the economies and how they should do things. And all of that paints a picture of these individuals getting high levels of press attention and being broadcast across the world as people who are essentially experts in climate by virtue of being climate activists. It paints a picture of people being platformed and essentially being used as useful idiots by other people that have deeper ulterior motives. And I think a clear example of this is the oil heiress, who has been funding a number of direct action climate activist groups who do a lot of performative stunts, like throwing oil on windows of buildings of companies that they feel are quote-unquote climate sinners, of doing things like blocking private planes in airports, of going into grocery stores and smashing cartons of milk or spilling cartons of milk across the floor in terms of vegan protest. Doing all these kinds of stunts that raise attention, raise some level of attention to their cause, but at the end of the day represent very minor inconveniences, if even that, to the very people who have vested interest in fossil fuels and maintaining the very economy that they're trying to attack. So this level of ineffectiveness towards the actual power, this lack of threat that they have to actual power, combined with the level of attention that their stunts generate and the level of conversation and engagement that their stunts generate, make it very clear that, very similar to at least the early times of Donald Trump, is that these are folks that are essentially seen as, one, very effective lightning rods that draw public attention away from other areas, but number two is that they drive engagement. So they're actually profitable to platform from a media perspective. And that is what's seen as more important, at least in this day and age, from a media perspective, is like, what can you do to get the most attention? And it's these kinds of things. But for somebody that needs effective lightning rods to hide their own activity, this set of people and this type of person is a perfect foil for what they're trying to do, because this person has no self-awareness of what their role really is in this game. They have such a God complex that their whole focus is on this performative rage, this performative exercise of what they're passionate about, and getting an audience to actually see that passion. That is what is actually motivating and driving the behaviors and activities across the space. And so that's kind of how I see this as, you know, this is a set of people who are essentially industry plants, that their role is not to actually be what I'll say, you know, serious solutioners to the problems. That's not their role at all. Even the stated role of like starting conversation and getting the scientists and the politicians to actually be the ones to solve that problem, even that's a bit unrealistic and in bad faith. In part because we already know, we've seen it over the last 10 years with the proliferation of big tech and the level of power that big tech has within American society, that the private sector moves light years faster than the public sector when it comes to mobilizing capital at scale and actually changing human behaviors, like meaningfully changing patterns of human behaviors. So to say that, no, it's the government's job and only the government's job to do this, it doesn't really make any sense. When you say it's the job of the politicians and it's the job of the scientists, right? You're yielding authority at the same time that you're demanding a platform. What is the point of demanding a platform if you have no authority? That's the question that I would ask. And that's the question that a lot of people are asking. Particularly in the global south, you also have the additional element of, you are lecturing me, you are a 20-something, you know, European, 20-something American who has never lived in this country, who does not understand the struggles that people deal with or the economic issues that are prevalent or the economic factors that crush the ability for people to make money. But yet you're coming here with this grand moral philosophy that you're demanding that we apply universally, whether it's, you know, veganism, whether it is, you know, abandonment of oil and gas and fossil fuels and renewables only. You have these very black and white understanding of these issues without any kind of local understanding of the nuance or of the challenges that people are facing and how what you're presenting may create actual problems. At the end of the day, the philosophy that they're actually presenting, whether it's degrowth, whether it's anti-capitalism, is extremely logically inconsistent. If you are arguing for anti-capitalism, in my view, what you're actually arguing for is authoritarianism, is complete authoritarianism. But the logically inconsistent piece behind it is that if you're arguing for authoritarianism, the very things that you're complaining about, right, particularly the lack of accountability, the lack of control that the voter has over these billionaire classes who are engaging in state capture, which are fair arguments or fair points, is that you have less control over that in an authoritarian state. Completely, far less control over that in an authoritarian state. But moreover, they've also demonstrated a fundamental lack of understanding of what capitalism actually is. And they're conflating the layers of political ideologies that are brought to the table by people who have large stakes within the capitalist system. You're confusing their individual philosophies and their particular takes on social organization, their sense of either conservatism or liberalism or whatever. You're conflating that and their success within the capitalist system with capitalism itself. And I think that's a very dangerous mistake, but again, it's very emblematic of the lack of nuance and the lack of understanding that these people actually have about the systems that they're attacking and they're arguing that we should make major changes to. But just to kind of simplify it, like there are five core aspects of or components of capitalist philosophy. So the first one is that private property ownership is fundamental, right? So when you're arguing for an anti-capitalist system, you're essentially arguing against a system that allows for private property ownership and individual control over your own body and what you own and what you accumulate around you. And again, everybody assumes that such a state, everyone who's arguing for this kind of outcome, assumes that such a state would be nice to them. But history shows that the state is never nice to the very peasants who they use as cannon fodder to actually create the revolution. The state always turns on the revolutionaries. Now the second piece of capitalism is that people are free to enter contracts as they see fit. And that's kind of an extension of this private property piece. But I think, moreover, what it gets into is this idea of the relationship between labor and capitalists. And in this context, a capitalist is somebody that deploys money or resources specifically for the creation of real assets. So in this case, we're talking about the agreement that this capitalist has with labor. And what we're saying is that in a capitalistic system, that relationship is by free choice. Now, maybe a direct contrast to this is, in a European context, feudal serfdom, where you're essentially bonded to your feudal lord. You do not have the freedom to go to another estate and work there. You don't have the freedom to take on another job. You are essentially stuck in this particular role and this particular piece of land, and you do not have control over that contract. What we're arguing in an anti-capitalist state is that that is an okay outcome. That it is okay for the state to dictate what job you can have, whether or not you can even leave the patch of land. So if things get really bad, you might be forced to be stuck in a terrible environment. If things become abusive, you are forced to be stuck in that particular environment. There's no getting out of that, right? Again, that's what anti-capitalism is essentially a proponent of. Now, the third aspect of capitalism is that trustworthy institutions are necessary to actually enforce private property and contract rights. So if those first two elements are gone, private property and the freedom to enter in contracts, you don't need those trustworthy institutions to manage that. And so then what you replace that with could be anything, but there's nothing limiting or constraining the state to actually have a forum for people to hash out contract disputes, right? It all becomes, justice essentially becomes at the whim of the state. Justice in this sense is in the context of like dealing with contractual disputes, breach of contract, etc., right? Everything becomes at the whim of the government or the whim of the state. So fourth is that profit is a powerful wealth building motivator. So in this case, anti-capitalism is saying that it should not be. So they're kind of applying a normative framework to this, that profit should not be the primary motivator. It should be something else, which, okay, I think that could be fair, that it should be something else, maybe. Again, I'm not going to judge and dictate to people how they should think or how they should feel about certain issues. And I think that also gets into the issue that I have here, which is essentially you are presupposing a particular moral framework onto everybody in terms of how everybody should feel. And again, people misunderstand capitalism when they try to apply a normative framework to capitalism, because capitalism is a positivistic economic theory, not a normative one. So a positivistic or positive economic theory is one that is the aspects or tenets of the theory are based on empirical data. So in the case of capitalism, there was a 10-year empirical research study that Adam Smith did that looked at and compared economies of France, the numerous German states in the late 18th century, as well as the UK, and compared all three of those, compared their economies, compared their social frameworks, compared their legal frameworks, to understand why, the UK and the German states, despite being much smaller, had much higher levels of wealth than France, that had bigger population and had much more land, right? So it's based on it's based on sort of data and empirical research. Whereas a normative theory is based really just on a moral framework, what should and shouldn't be. The issue and the danger with applying moral frameworks and sort of moral imperatives on everybody is that people have different moral perspectives. I think it's very, very clear, for example, in the West versus the East versus like much of Africa, what is considered right and wrong when it comes to things like doing business, paying bribes or quid pro quo, right? Morally in the West, that is frowned upon, and it's sort of loudly frowned upon and shamed. In countries like South Korea or China or Zimbabwe or South Africa, I mean, it's a very different story. Or Tanzania, for example, it's a very different story in terms of like your relationship with other people and how you do business. And then lastly is that profits are the highest when capital is actively put to use rather than passively rent-seeking. And this is the ironic part, is that This, more than any other aspect of capitalism, is what anti-capitalists actually agree with capitalism about. Because Adam Smith, just as much as climate activists today who are highlighting consumerism and capitalism as sort of the evils that are driving this overconsumption, both agree that rent-seeking, right? And in this context, what we're talking about when we say rent-seeking, we're explicitly talking about the financialization of economies, which you can point to the Chicago School and monetarism, which is sort of like an offshoot of capitalism that developed in, we'll call it like the 1930s was when the Chicago School was established, but it really came into prominence in the 1970s with Nobel laureate Milton Friedman, who was a superstar for a period of time in sort of central banking and high finance types of circles and economic circles for his approach to monetary theory. But in any case, monetarism and the adoption of monetarism really drove financialization of the economy. And when we say financialization, what we're talking about is, again, because I say this a lot in a lot of my videos, I really talk about it because I think it's a really important aspect that we need to pay attention to, and that is, I think, driving a lot of issues in our modern economy. But financialization is a system in which central bankers and banks have essentially affected state capture and are driving state-level policy and specifically state-level economic policy. And so the natural impact of that is that whoever controls the state will drive capital towards themselves. And so in this case, you're having entities that are driving all capital to themselves, driving all capital to banks. Banks become the gatekeeper of liquidity and of capital, and therefore of all economic activity. The thing is, the banks make the most amount of money by rent seeking. When you look at the returns from investing in risk assets versus the returns of investing in real assets, generally you're going to have significantly higher returns with risk assets. The issue, though, is that they're high risk. And so this is where the state capture comes in, because what we've seen is that we've had central banks that have effectively developed tactics such as debt monetization that have essentially created a backstop that de-risk those assets. And I'm using de-risk incorrectly. De-risking really refers to like getting rid of risk assets from your portfolio and moving to less risky assets. But in this context, I talk about de-risk from the standpoint of you're essentially removing the risk of failure or removing volatility from these risk assets by doing things like providing 0% interest or interest rates that are approaching 0%. We're effectively driving the cost of capital to these large investors down to zero. So you're essentially playing with free money to make these high-risk investments. So we've seen a 40-year cycle in which we have progressively inched closer and closer to 0% interest rates. There was a spike, in the late 70s and early 80s, but essentially the late 70s, early 80s was the kickoff of that point, right? Because it's been about 40 years since then, where there's a spike in the 80s of ultra-high interest rates to fight the high inflation of that time period. But once that inflation was essentially arrested and stopped, you saw a steady decrease over 40 years of interest rates all the way down to zero. And at the same time, simultaneously, we saw a number of bubbles. We saw an explosion in asset prices for risk assets or for financial assets. And the ratio of value of financial assets to real assets in the economy became very much out of balance. And to the point where we're today, where real assets are at their lowest point in terms of value relative to financial assets. The countries that really do embody anti-capitalism, they are places that Western climate activists and Western activists in general, anti-capitalists, would never consider living, because they would not have the kind of quality of life and they would not have the level of attention and platform that they do here in the West. So again, that's coming back to this idea of folks not really understanding what they're talking about, or understanding even the systems or the mechanisms that they're attacking. They simply have the abridged Cliff Notes version of what capitalism is. They confuse corporatism. They confuse other political ideologies or political frameworks that are layered on top of a capitalistic system and think that that is the real thing. So that is one thing that is deeply problematic in their approach to things. But I think it's also a hindrance to them actually having real acceptance within sort of the political spaces that they think they're influencing, but they're really not. So what do you think? Do you agree with what I'm saying? Am I full of it? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And please like and subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next video.